This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. I'm Rosemary McGee, and I'm proud to serve as director of our manuscript archive and rare book library here at Emory, and the Emory Libraries are proud to sponsor these programs and events. And we're so glad to have all of you here with us today, and which will be followed by a poetry reading by Paul Muldoon in Glenn Auditorium, which will be followed by an opening reception, the official opening of our exhibition. And I hope you have many opportunities to wander around and through it because it's absolutely stunning. Today, we have a panel called Feeling into Words, a conversation about Seamus Heaney, which features three distinguished guests in conversation about Seamus Heaney, moderated by Emory professor Geraldine Higgins. As many of you know, in his essay, Feeling into Words, Seamus Heaney references William Wordsworth and the various pathways described as hiding places, the hiding places. He, that is Heaney, names poetry as divination, as revelation of the self to the self, and as restoration of the culture to itself. Poems seek continuity along with the aura and authenticity of archaeological finds. Poetry is a dig for finds. Perhaps the exhibition just outside our door is such a dig into ourselves and our shared understandings. If so, we have no better guides than our panelists this afternoon. My introductions will be short, although their credentials are lengthy. What we are gathered here to experience, however, is something about their own thoughts on this topic, feelings into words. Our guides, our panelists include, on my far left, Bernard O'Donoghue, noted contemporary Irish poet and academic, currently fellow and tutor in Old English and Medieval English and linguistics and the history of the English language at Wadham College, Oxford. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, he is also an award-winning poet of at least 7 or maybe 8 volumes of poetry and works in translation. He has a wide range of specialties, including work on courtly love. About his work, he states that the Anglo-Saxon elegies are his model for the perfectly formed lyric poem. He has written about and in honor of Seamus Heaney, including a poem published just this week in the Irish Times in his honor, The Boat, which asks us to take the case of a man in a boat in deep water, perhaps the condition we all face. Next to him, moving closer here, is Fiona Ross, who has been the director of the National Library of Ireland since March 2010. We have a lot in common because under her leadership, the NLI is undertaking a significant transformation with the aim of creating a 21st century digital library that can reach anyone with an interest in Ireland, and as we know, there are many. She is widely recognized as one of the most dynamic leaders in the management of cultural institutions. She sits on the committees of the Council of National Cultural Institutions, Irish Ancestry Research Center, Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, and many, many others. She is also a member of the Irish Manuscripts Commission and the Dublin Creative Alliance. She has undertaken academic research in the area of governance and reputation. Fiona Ross has lectured in University College Dublin and at the Irish Management Institute. She has also worked in the areas of corporate governance, reputation, ethics, and she spent over 20 years in senior finance, marketing, and communications with roles in Ireland, UK, US, and Asia. So we're looking forward to her thoughts as well. Next to her is Fintan O'Toole, columnist, literary editor, and drama critic for the Irish Times, as well as drama critic for the New York Daily News and regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. He is known for his work as author, literary critic, historical writer, and political commentator. In fact, he has offered commentary on topics as diverse as Ireland's Celtic Tiger, the politics of Irish beef, and literature, including Shakespeare is hard, but so is life. Amen. Further recent works include an essay in The Guardian last fall that celebrates the unruly tongue of the English language, and a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times, Ireland's Rebound is European Blarney. Considered one of Ireland's most respected cultural critics and great Irish intellectuals, most recently O'Toole has been a visiting lecturer in Irish Letters at Princeton University. Our panelists are led by their moderator, Geraldine Higgins, who specializes in 20th century Irish literature and culture. She joined the Emory faculty in 1996 after completing her education at Trinity College, Oxford, and Trinity College, Dublin. Her academic works address the troubled connections between art and the representation of violence, between tradition and modernity. Her teaching extends from Carlyle to Yeats to Seamus Heaney to Brian Friel, and on him she has undertaken a critical study of Ireland's most influential and important living playwright. Professor Higgins is also director of Emory's Irish Studies program. She is, as well, as we now see splendidly displayed around us, a scholar of great depth and intensity and passion and creativity, the guiding and heroic spirit behind this magnificent Heaney exhibition, which we are celebrating this weekend. Curator, scholar, and creative spirit, I now turn this discussion over to my much admired colleague, Professor Geraldine Higgins.
Thanks very much, Rosemary, and welcome everybody to our panel this afternoon. We're absolutely thrilled, as you can imagine, to have these incredible scholars and leading lights in Ireland's cultural and intellectual life here with us this afternoon. And we really did want this to be a conversation, so we don't really have a very formal structure, but what we thought we'd start with, I was going to ask each of the panelists to speak for 10 or 15 minutes about Seamus Heaney, and then we will have some questions and open things up to the floor. So we're going to begin with Fintan O'Toole, who's you've just heard and can read every day in the Irish Times and often in the New York Times. So I'm going to turn things over to Fintan.
Thanks. Can I do that a second?
Sorry?
Will I stay here? Or?
Oh, stay here. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've never been in Emory before, but I think anybody who's interested in Irish literature knows about Emory. It has an enormous presence because of the scholarly work that's done here, and also, of course, the magnificent collections in the library and the archive. So it's a particular pleasure to finally be here. And of course, you know, for anybody who is Irish, it's a particular honour to be here commemorating Seamus Heaney with this superb exhibition. There's one of Seamus's most well-known, beautiful poems, which is called Mossbawn Sunlight, begins with the line, "There was a sunlit absence." And for those of us in Ireland, we have to change the tense. There is a sunlit absence, and both parts of that phrase are probably equally important. The absence is absolutely enormous. Seamus Heaney's death is an irreparable loss for Irish culture, but also for Irish life, Irish public life, Irish people's sense of citizenship, sense of who they are, which has taken an enormous battering in recent years for economic and political reasons. And there's still a sense in which the country is mourning the loss of Seamus Heaney. And part of that is because of his work, his direct work, but part of it is because of the sheer graciousness of his presence. He was just one of those very rare figures who brought a kind of civic elegance, I would call it, to bear on public life. And of course, this was very strongly related to the nature of his poetry. What poetry teaches above all is tact. Poetry is about the control of language and emotion. And Seamus Heaney, I think, managed to transform that tact of language into a tact of political presence, and I mean political in the broadest sense. But he became, and I don't think it's something he particularly wanted to be, but he became, in spite of himself, a kind of touchstone of civic decency and of public tact, which matters enormously not just in Irish culture, but in all our cultures at the moment. The sense of being careful about what you say, not out of timidity, but out of care itself, out of a sense that language and the forces that language unleashes has power to bless and has power to curse, and therefore needs to be handled with a sort of delicacy. And it was that delicacy of personality and of work, I think, that made Seamus Heaney such an enormous loss to us in his death. But to go back to the phrase about a sunlit absence, the absence is nevertheless sunlit. It's sunlit by, of course, the legacy of the work itself. It does feel that we're still both warmed and illuminated by the work. And we're warmed and illuminated by it because we haven't consumed it. Like the sun itself, it gives off an energy which may run out sometime, but not in a period that we've got to worry about. And this is, for a poet who was a public presence in Ireland from very early on, really certainly from 1966 onwards, it is rather remarkable that there's still a sense of mystery about the poems, that you have to come back to them. Even the ones you think you know really well, you've got to come back to them again and again and again. And so I just wanted to talk for the next 2 hours or so about for the next couple of minutes, just about what the mystery is and how we might think about placing Heaney as a poet. There is another phrase in a poem called Hailstones, which I think is very much featured in the exhibition rather beautifully and is really worth looking at. And in the poem, typically, Heaney describes what is a common experience, which is the experience of a shower of hailstones. That's what it is. And then the memory of catching hailstones in one's hand and of both the pain of a hailstone, it hurts, and then the melting away in your hand. And the phrase he uses is the melt of the real thing smarting into its absence. And absence, the sunlit absence, the smart of absence really seems to me to be what characterizes Heaney's work. It's very easy to get Heaney wrong. I think on a quick reading, he looks like a sort of nostalgic figure, someone who is really obsessed with a world that is long gone, almost a pre-electric, rural, agricultural world. And actually, the point about Heaney is that he is an utterly contemporary figure. And he's utterly contemporary because what drives his work is not the immersion in that world of his childhood, but is the loss of that world of childhood. It's the absence that becomes a presence. And it becomes a presence, I think, for whatever those strange sets of biological and biographical conjunctions that makes poets. But obviously in Heaney's case, he was born on a farm, and then the family moved a couple of miles to another farm. You would think this was an epic, utterly traumatic event. But I suppose if you're 5 years old, it is. And it seals memory in a certain kind of way. And that happened to him. And then the other thing that happened to him was that he was then removed from that context as an adolescent, to go to the big city to school. So the act of removal the act of losing is absolutely built into all of his work, in a way that actually prepares us for his own absence. He is oddly absent. I suppose one simple way of trying to define what Heaney does would be to use one of the cliched but nevertheless magnificent phrases about what poetry is. I mean, the one we all know, William Wordsworth's definition of poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility. And perhaps to get a sense of why Heaney is not a romantic poet, is that neither of those terms is true in Heaney's work. The emotion is not there. The emotion is restrained, removed, and absented from the actual verse itself, so that, of course, the reader can choose to feel it. I think one of the reasons why people get this sense of accessibility about Heaney, it's a paradoxical sense of accessibility, because it draws you in by virtue of what's not given to you rather than what is. And so this sense of tact, this sense of restraint is also emotional in Heaney. It's really quite interesting to read the poems again and realize he's not making us feel anything. He's leaving it up to us to do that all the time. And he has this incredible sense of self-control over the restraint of his own emotion. But also the tranquility isn't there either. So I would say that, in Heaney, what you get is not emotion, it's sensation. And it's not tranquility, it's motion. So for Heaney, poetry is sensation recollected in motion. And the one thing that's common with Wordsworth is recollection. Recollection is absolutely critical to Heaney. He is fundamentally a poet of memory. But so his procedure is to experience the sensation of the real, like the sting of the hailstones on the palm of the hand, but then to feel it melting into its absence, and that absence is memory. It's the absence then that requires the act of memorizing and reconstructing in language. And that's the movement of a Heaney poem all the time. One of the reasons why I think he's sometimes misunderstood as a sort of nostalgic poet is that people tends to lose sight of the fact that he's one of the great laureates of the automobile. Heaney's unimaginable without the car. Two of his most important poems, of course, and they relate very much to each other over a period of time. They speak to each other, but Peninsula, when you have nothing more to say, just drive for a day all around the peninsula. And then, of course, he picks that up again later on in Postscript, which again is very beautifully featured in the exhibition. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore. And driving is both obviously real biographical fact. He seemed to really like driving places. But also, I think, a matter of placing himself really importantly in terms of poetic procedure and in relation to the real. Because when you're driving, you are both inside and outside. You're in the landscape, but somehow not of it. You are experiencing it, but experiencing it in motion. In Postscript, if you know that poem, what he says is, in the end of the poem, he experiences this landscape in an extraordinarily clear way, and we happen to know that piece of ground, the flaggy shore, very well, and every time you go there, you're just amazed at the exactitude of his capturing of the light and the wind and the movement of things. But what he says then is, there's no point in stopping the car and thinking you will experience it better. Because the point, of course, that he comes to, and I think it's maybe one of the critical lines in Heaney, he says, "You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass." And this really is quite radical and very contemporary. You know, the sense that the space that's occupied here is somewhere between the real and the imagined. And I think you always kind of picture Heaney hovering between those states. And the motor car, funny enough, is one of the ways in which you hover between here and there, that you're neither quite one or the other. And that sense of being a hurry through which known and strange things pass, that's the self. And actually it's a very late 20th century, certainly post-war, existentialist definition of the self. You know, one of the things that makes Heaney, again, not a romantic poet is that there is no fixed self in Heaney to experience these emotions. That's why he withholds the emotions so much. There's a darkness in the work that we come back to. I think, again, when you first read Heaney, there's the warmth and the immediacy. And then the more you read, the more you're conscious, I think, of a darkness that's there. And I think it's a philosophical darkness. You know, it's a darkness of human existence in a way. I would relate it to what the philosopher Ernst Bloch called the darkness of the lived-in moment, you know, which is that actually while we're living a moment, it is dark to us because we're living it. And therefore, our light, our illumination on it comes from memory. Even if it's a memory of a split second later, we become aware of what it is we're living. And this is why memory is so critical to Heaney, so that the moment itself is always dark, and it has to be illuminated in retrospect. And that illumination, of course, is where the magic of the work lies, his capacity to illuminate what is gone. And in a way, his look as a poet was that a lot of what he knew as a child went. There's a phrase used by the Scottish critic Tom Nairn, used it about Walter Scott. And he was trying to describe how Scots, like why does Walter Scott write in such brilliant detail about the Gaelic society of the Highlands, for example, at the moment when that society is vanishing or has almost vanished. And Nairn uses this phrase, valedictory realism. And I think you could apply that to Heaney. You know, I think his realism, which is so acute and gives you that almost tactile sense of feeling these objects that he records so superbly, but it is always valedictory. It is always about the end of the world in which these objects exist. This makes him, I think, of enormous importance. Obviously, he's of enormous importance for his absolute technical mastery, his linguistic gift. But he's also of extraordinary importance for our moment, I think, because he may well be the last great poet who had access to a pre-electric world. I mean, not just to a pre-digital world, because unfortunately most of us here have access to that, but to a pre-electric world, you know, to a world where physical objects occupied space in our lives in a way that they no longer would. But the point is not to nostalgically recreate that world. It's actually the strange, somewhat dark experience of having to recollect a world that is effectively dead. Not just people who are dead, but that every detail of that world has been rendered impossible by massive social change. And that world, of course, is the world that most human beings who have ever been on the earth have lived in. It is a world before our kind of world. And we, I think, as contemporary people, one of our besetting sins is a certain kind of arrogance about the past, a certain patronizing of the past. And I think one of the things that happened to Heaney was that was impossible for him because he knew enough of that world for it to be absolutely real to him. He launched a book that I'd done, A History of Ireland in 100 Objects, last March. And when he was talking about it, he said, I thought, a fascinating thing, he said that he found the objects at the beginning of the book, which were Neolithic, much closer to his own world than the ones at the end of the book, which were things like Intel microchips. And he wasn't exaggerating in the sense that actually if you look at the poems, so many of the objects in the book are very like, the fish traps, for example, that people are using. I can't imagine the shovel or spade. The basic technology has changed all that much over a very long period of time. Horse plowing, of course. I mean, all those kinds of things that are there. But they have that extraordinary tension around them, that the entire world in which they make sense is gone. And therefore they hover between this precious reality on the one side and this darkness of non-existence on the other side. And I just think what happens to Seamus Heaney perhaps was that he, because of his own circumstances and his own mind and his own personality, had access to an inability to patronize the past. That actually he understood at a really, really profound level that the world he was living in was not the only world. That human experience was encoded in all sorts of other physical and linguistic ways. And that ultimately maybe is one of the sources of this grace that he had. There's a kind of humility which sits oddly in one ways with his mastery, his extraordinary mastery in what he does. And there's a very clear sense of his own power as a poet. But I think it's always in tension with this really powerful humility about what the world itself is that he occupies. And that, I think, gave him this amazing balance, this extraordinary restraint, that he doesn't tell anybody what to think. He doesn't tell anybody what to feel. He presents the poems to us as spaces that we ourselves are ultimately allowed to occupy. And finally, if you think about that in political terms, in terms of the Irish dilemma of the last 35 years, to use a ridiculous euphemism, that sense of humility, that sense of restraint, that sense of not knowing everything, that sense that actually history is a long, long process in which one must avoid making the mistake of thinking that what's going on now is everything. Those qualities really mattered absolutely enormously to his society and to Ireland itself. It seems to me the only times in Heaney's poems when he goes wrong is when he loses a sense of confidence in the power of his own poetry to contribute so much to the society. When the moral Heaney comes into play and he starts thinking, I really need to say something about the conflict, he's not at his best. He's forced into a kind of language perhaps that doesn't quite suit him. It's when he restrains that impulse and holds out for the society the idea that actually there are resources within language itself, resources of ambiguity, resources of complexity, resources of dignity and tact, which perhaps the society, when it's ready, might draw on. I think ultimately Ireland did get to a point where it could draw on those extraordinary gifts that Seamus Heaney gave it. And I think most Irish people will remain incredibly grateful for those gifts. Thanks.
I'm just going to ask a couple of follow-up questions and then I'll turn to Fiona.
Great, yeah.
I just was so struck by, I think, your description of a Heaney that's quite new to us, this idea of the Heaney who occupies a philosophical darkness or has this ambiguous relationship to the past, because I think, as you say, it's much easier to think of him as a poet who's always returning there. And one of the ways that struck me when we were putting together the map for the exhibition, I expected to find lots of quotes that were, that were laudatory about place and that were, and there are a few, but the quote that I was thinking of when you were speaking is the one from Squarings where he says, "The places I go back to have not failed but will not last." And that seems that you're right to call us on thinking about Heaney as a nostalgic poet. That that's the easy way to think about his him dealing with the past.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other thing I was also. I love your book on the history of the world on 100 objects, and to think of Heaney and objects, that how many of those solid things are in the poems. We have buckets, we have clearly a spade, we have butter churns, and we have all of these ways that he gives us things to hold on to, and then, as you say, it leaves us to do with that what we will. And I wondered if you could just say a little more before we move on about Ireland's reaction to Heaney's death, about how you experienced that in the Irish Times and the ways that.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think it was an enormous tribute to him that he allowed the country to be at its best. I mean, Ireland. It's a small place, and we know how awful we are, as you do in a small place. And we've been through a very tough time with all sorts of things. And I think the extraordinary thing with Heaney's death was that the sense of loss was absolutely shared. Yeah. There was no real division about it. And it was spontaneous and real for people. I mean, you would talk to people on the bus, that would talk about him. And they may not have read a single poem. Mm-hmm. It didn't quite matter. They just loved the idea that he was there.
Right. And
he had acquired a sort of ceremonial function in a way. As you've got to remember, almost everything else went. Like the church mm-hmm. lost its authority over scandals. The political system nobody quite likes anymore. The banks, behaved disgracefully. All the centres of authority failed, and you were left with the poet. Yeah. And it's in itself a really interesting thing. And maybe it's not just for Ireland, but if you think about what would you be left with if all of this went, if the money goes and the economy goes, you do realise actually you kind of need these people. Yeah. Because there is a certain kind of integrity that attaches to great poetry, and that search for the right words mm-hmm. has a moral, civic, political content. And I think that's what people in Ireland just realised. And it was a simple thing of, who would you get to sit beside the Queen? Now, Heaney had said in, actually, I think very funny kind of pamphlet that he wrote when he was included in the Penguin Book of British Verse, and he didn't want to be, and he wrote this kind of long, very funny poem about this, But he has the couplet, and I'm sure I'm misquoting it, but I must protest my passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen. But then he did, So when Queen Elizabeth came to Dublin, there was literally only one possible person you could put sitting beside her. Obviously you had the President of Ireland on one side, that's quite important. But the only person who would actually make Irish people feel, we've got a king. We're not afraid of the Queen anymore. We actually, that's fine. And I'm being kind of facetious about this, but also half serious, that it really psychologically mattered to Irish people that you had a figure of that nature who could carry himself with such dignity, that you knew that his response to an occasion like that, you could just trust him absolutely to be right about it. Not to crawl, not to, go over the top in terms of forgetting about all the historical wrongs or any of that stuff, but also, to just behave with the kind of grace that he brought to bear on everything. And you just kind of, I think we just kind of realized we were incredibly fortunate, to have him. We've no right to have him, and we're very fortunate that we have him in another form. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people are going back and reading the poems, and I think that is in itself maybe the greatest legacy. And I think a lot of people I talk to are finding the poems, much more complicated than they thought they were. Yeah. When you don't have Seamus's benign personality behind them, when you actually divorce them from this wonderful person, they actually, they occupy a kind of space that's a lot more contemporary and disturbed, I think, than you perhaps might think at first.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Fintan's obituary in the Irish Times was wonderful, and he said, that comfort is to be found in his poems. And we were saying that, I suppose the difference, I think, for Heaney, in Heaney's death, the way it was treated in Ireland and the way it's treated here in America, that, in America we've lost this great man, but we'll always have the poetry. And in Ireland, there's a deeper sense of, we have the poetry, but we've lost this great man. And there was a wonderful letter to the Irish Times in the couple of days after his death that had the phrase, "The nation is a man down." And it just really summed it up. So we're going to turn now to Fiona Ross, who's this is her last public appearance as the director of
this
the
is an
National
incredible
Library of
moment
Ireland.
for me because, thank you, Geraldine, and this is indeed my last public role as National Librarian, and it's very fitting for me to be here today, and I'm delighted to be here today because I guess, without a shadow of doubt, the high point of my time as National Librarian was the acquisition of Seamus's archive back in 2011, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the course of my comments. And I wanted to pick up a little bit on what Fintan gave me a good entree there, and as you did as well, Geraldine. I wanted to kind of cover three things with you in my comments today, and first is to talk about my experience with Seamus and with his work, and also then to talk about the archive, and also then to talk about exhibitions. Obviously, it's very fitting as we prepare for the public launch of today's exhibition, having seen the sneak preview last night. I'm an accidental National Librarian, and as Rosemary pointed out earlier, I spent the bulk of my career, about 25 years, in financial services. And one bored day at the dealing room desk, took a look at the back of the Irish Times, my favourite newspaper, where they had an ad for the National Librarian. And so it's kind of hard to believe that you'd run a newspaper ad, but they did. And in my boredom of the stock market, I thought, gosh, wouldn't that just be the greatest job on earth? And I applied, and I have a good track record of applying to job ads in newspapers, I have to say. I've been lucky. And I was lucky enough and privileged enough to be appointed to that role in March, as you say, 2010. I was a refugee at that stage from the financial services sector and the banking sector, and happy to take a leave of absence from that world. But I didn't expect to fall in love with the sector. The library, archive and literary sector, as I did, and it's now painful for me to be moving on from that, and I'm not quite sure what the future holds. I'm not too worried, but hopefully it will great things. But one of the things I wanted to discuss today really was to try and share with you my perspective of someone who is, if I sat here a year ago, would have to make a confession, and I'd have to say to this room, hi, my name is Fiona, and I don't read poetry. And it's something that I know for this audience might be difficult, but for those who are not here today, but who are in the grocery store or minding their kids or on the side of a pitch, a lot of people, as you said, Fintan, in Ireland, and certainly a lot of people in general, don't have that opportunity or don't have that sense or don't have that comfort level to actually pick up a book of poetry. I can now say I do read poetry, and it's probably Seamus's poetry, the collected works, were my Christmas gift from my husband, and I've now been able to fall back in love and start. And I tell that story against myself simply to say, admittedly, there's a very enthusiastic audience here today, but to those for whom it is something that they're not comfortable or they don't want to do, is to make that bridge and to go back that road and to not forget and to restart that journey or that love affair with poetry. And I think even last night at the Revellers at the 12th night, to hear the poetry, and obviously we've poets in the audience today, and Bernard and Paul, etc. It's just to say, perhaps I represent those that are not as familiar with Seamus's work, haven't read everything. Despite having an English degree from Trinity College, I left it and went to the City of London very quickly after I graduated. So it's part of my own story is to also then quickly bridge to Seamus and say, despite my poor credentials in the space, both as a National Librarian but also as someone who would be gifted to be in post when Seamus's archive came to the National Library, I cannot overestimate the way in which, or compliment enough, Seamus treated me during that process. And that was something that was very personal. At no point did I feel I had to prove my credentials to him, to talk to him about the archive and about the timing of its arrival at the National Library, the negotiations, the discussions. And it was just something that happened very naturally and organically, that he made that gift to the Irish nation, to the state, and obviously to the citizens of the world who have an interest in his work. I'm sure there's many in the audience And I came to this very late, so I came almost at the end of Seamus's life. I mean, I obviously had met him in 2010 first. The archive came to us in December 2011, and we would have worked on a few projects, which I'll talk about in a moment, over the course of 2012 and right up until the time of his death. But very limited interaction, again, not having spent time studying or researching or reading his poetry. Very much as Fintan said, you took him for granted. He was just there. He was in the background. It was someone, a touchstone, a figure that you just, and again, a father figure is a great way of describing it. And that element of being, if we had a king, it would have been Seamus. And I was thinking about trying to describe what it was like to come, when you're so involved now with a person and their archive, but you come to it so late and you haven't grown up with it and understood it and read it and dissected it. It's like, I don't know how many people here watch Netflix. I'm sure quite a few people. I see a few nodding heads. You know that moment where you load your program and it starts at the end? And then what do? You put your finger on the screen and you drag it back. And I think that's a really great way of describing archives, because you have a frame-by-frame thumbnail as you pull your finger across the bottom of the screen of little snapshots of that program, that show, that TV show, that movie. And that's what it's like looking at an archive, because everything you look at in an archive, a literary archive, represents a moment in time, a manuscript, a document, a draft, something that person worked on at that particular point in time. And you can freeze frame it, and you can look at that. And for me, coming at the end and working backwards, it's like I get the chance, and indeed all of us who can look at archives, to rewind that person's life, their creative process, their context, their political involvement, what was going on around them in the world at the time, the friends, the correspondence. And it's just a fantastic opportunity. And I think that's one of the things that I've come to absolutely appreciate about working certainly as a National Librarian, but also I think hopefully something that I will take with me in the future, is that joy of accessing archives. And it's something that we just should never just take for granted. And the opportunities, as I say, to look back and to stop it at 1972 or stop it in 1986 and take a look at something and review it and look at it in context. When we first spoke to Seamus about his own archive coming to the National Library, obviously the letters and a lot of the correspondence were here at Emory, and we knew that. Seamus wasn't well at that particular point in time, so it was a very quick, quiet meeting. And it was a difficult decision, and Mary obviously attended these meetings as well with Seamus in my beautiful office at the National Library, which I'll sorely miss, because it is Yeats's own library, is the walls. So I have Yeats's library as my office decor. But Seamus would sit there, we had a cup of tea, and it was very much a decision that they had to take. And we just said, it's your decision. It's your archive, it's your work. And we just left it. And we never called, and we didn't make any attempts to push that process along, being very respectful of the fact that it was a difficult decision for the family to make. I had the added benefit of, again, I keep saying I'm lucky in life, that Susie Tyrrell, who many of you will know, was Seamus's PA. Susie and I are next door neighbours, literally a terraced, and I could knock on my wall in my basement, and she could knock back. And it was a great way of staying in touch with Seamus and Mary and understanding when might be an appropriate time to have the conversation again. But anyway, time rolled on a little bit. I think Mary had been a trustee of the National Library, so she was very keen that the papers would come to the National Library. And indeed, they did come. The decision was taken, and the paperwork was organised, etc. And on the day, I can remember it was featured in the media. It was raining, and I guess there was probably no other way of doing this, but Seamus carried his own archive. From the boot of the car, the trunk of the car, in the car park of number 4 Kildare Street, with staff members running down the fire escape with umbrellas to cover the boxes. And now that's not something you should be too proud of, and particularly in a rare books and library environment. But that was again very telling of the absolute, and anyone who knew Seamus, and most people in this room, a lot of people in this room knew him much better than I did. That was just exactly what he was going to do. He was going to carry boxes up from the little archival boxes. And then we had the unique experience of being able to work with him on the catalogue. And I know, Rand, you're here as well. You probably should come and check our catalogue and see what a good job or not we've done. But again, we have a poor track record of cataloguing at the National Library, simply by resources. But we reckon this was certainly an archive that we wanted to catalogue. But also because Seamus was still alive. So if we had a question, unlike cataloguing something that is the output of someone who is long past, we were able to phone them up and say, sorry to bother you, but was that really 72 or did you mean 73, or should that be in that box or that box? And that's a unique experience for the archivist and the cataloguer as well. So we managed to pull the catalogue together, and it's there on the National Library of Ireland's website. There's about over 300 individual items in the archive that came to us in 19 boxes on that rainy day. And within it, there are probably a very large number of notebooks. And again, that's probably the kind of the pièce de résistance in the archive that Seamus gave us. And the notebooks cover absolutely everything part of his literary output. Drafts of poems, speeches, translations, and then random thoughts. And again, it'll take generations of, I hope, well-informed academics and researchers, or just lovers of his work, to take the time to go back and look at these. It's a treasure trove yet to be discovered, essentially almost unopened. I know we've made them available to you if you want to come and see them on a research basis, and we have obviously limited in terms of how often it can be accessed and when, and given its obviously value, it has to be done under certain circumstances. But again, I think for the journey going forward, there'll be many rich research activities associated with the archive, and it can only imagine what the connections will be that people will make, how they'll understand the creative process differently, and how they'll understand his work. And even for someone like Fintan, who has just gone through in great describing his sense of the poetry, for Fintan, you must come in and take a look at some of these notebooks as well. And I encourage those of you who are researching as well to make the trip and to come and access the archives, because that's what they're there for. And he was always very keen that they would be made available. We would love to digitize them. That's something that we'd hope to do as well, and make them more available. So that's the archive. And again, the catalogue information is there in terms of all of the specifics from 1966 up to 2010. Obviously almost 50 years of literary output. Lots of annotations, lots of drawings. A lot of them were the copybooks and the notebooks that his children gave him. There's a great comment where he's writing on something, and it's when he's getting his car service. So you have this great sense of doodles. The children put in scary pictures with all horrible, like kids draw these kind of monster faces, and you're thinking, is that Seamus on a bad day? No, it's not. It's actually one of the children or something like that. So they're and again, they're highly accessible. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the exhibition, and I think I'm just so thrilled, absolutely thrilled, that the exhibition is here and open. And I'm absolutely thrilled that Geraldine, that we met and we talked about that. We had high hopes, and perhaps still have high hopes, of having an exhibition in Ireland, and that's where we should have, and that's something that we probably should have talked about as well. Fintan, and certainly Bernard and Paul, and those of us who are from Ireland here know that we have a debt to Seamus, and the country certainly owes him definitely some form of exhibition or memorial that is fitting to him and his work. And at the time Geraldine came, she talked about this modest little exhibition she was going to do at Emory, and I have to say it's anything but modest, and I really do congratulate you and all of the curatorial team and all the people who've done the work here. I just wish we could transport it home. And I wish I could, and maybe we will, and that's something we need to talk about. But before Seamus died, we were planning and we were beginning to fundraise for a Heaney exhibition at the National Library, and so I had the opportunity to go meet with Seamus a couple of times. And remember, I'm a stockbroker turned national librarian, who is now confessed to a large group of people that she doesn't read a lot of poetry, sitting in the room and talking about what the exhibition should look like and could look like. And again, I go back to say that at no point in time was there any sense that he was second-guessing me or wished I was someone different, or that I had a better background or was a better curator. Just accepted me on face value as we worked through the process of what the exhibition might look like. And I can say, and again, just in reference and deference to the exhibition here, he wanted the exhibition. It was difficult for him because, again, it was only for Mary. Every time Seamus would get self-deprecating and go, "Oh, don't say that. I don't want that." Mary would pop out from the kitchens where she was frying aubergines, and she'd say, "Don't be silly, Seamus. You should have that in your exhibition. You should have that in your exhibition." And so it was because I think Mary has and still has a very strong sense of what might be an appropriate memorial for Seamus, and that's something that, again, a conversation that remains to be had both nationally and also certainly within the family. But we talked about it being very much a contemporary, modern exhibition about accessibility. He was very keen for it to include more than himself. And again, anyone who knows Seamus would know that he would not want to be the star of the show at all. And so he was very keen. Fiona, please make sure there's other poets in it, make sure that it's in context, make sure you involve everybody. And that was some of the promises that we talked about. And I'll finish by sharing with you the two almost final words that he said to me, and it was a couple of weeks before he died, when we were discussing where it would go, where the exhibition was going to go. And we have a space at the National Library where we have a wonderful Yeats exhibition. And the plan would be, the Yeats exhibition was only intended to be there for a couple of years. It's been there close on 10 years now because of our economic recession, which Fintan has outlined and written about extensively. So there's been no money to change it out. And Seamus said, Fiona, I really don't evict Yeats for me. And he said that. And I said, well, there's nowhere else for it to go. And that was then the context was about maybe being, that, and he meant that. And you knew he meant that. And you knew that he would be most uncomfortable. And I said, no, the plan, Seamus, is that Yeats is going to go to Sligo, which of course quickly had to become plan A of my planning process, where I had to then phone up people in Sligo saying, can we take the Yeats exhibition, maybe put in the Model, which is one of the museums in Sligo, which is where, by the way, the Yeats exhibition would be good to go to Sligo on a permanent basis. And the second thing which he said to me as I was leaving the house on Strand Road was, he said to me, and I'm going to get quite emotional, he said, don't make it too posthumous. I'm not dead yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. That was really wonderful. And I think I want to pick up on what you're saying about Seamus's reaction to the idea of any kind of exhibition featuring him. One of the faxes that we found when we were going through the correspondence is this wonderful fax to someone at Faber where he says they're going to make a museum in Balaki about me, and they're going to put it in a restored bog, and then he scores it out and writes Bon. So it seemed like the best kind of so Balahi Bon is there is a museum in Balaki that's about Seamus, but again he didn't want it to be just about him. No. There are letters to all the other poets saying send stuff to Balaki. It's not just to be about me. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm going to turn to Bernard O'Donoghue, our last featured speaker, who also, in addition to his own poetry and his position at Oxford, also edited the Cambridge Companion to Seamus Heaney and wrote a wonderful book on the language of Seamus Heaney and was the sort of driving force behind Heaney's position as the Professor of Poetry in Oxford from 1989 until 1994.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. And the first thing to say, of course, is how very grateful and honoured I am to be here amongst Seamus's friends. His great friend Ronald Shuhart, of course, who was a very important keeper of the Heaney tradition, as of many other poets and writers. And so I'm very grateful to Ronald and to Geraldine for having me here. It's a great thrill. It's absolutely the place to be, and I'm very pleased and honoured to be with my fellow contributors here. I'm going to talk in fairly general terms, really, going back to where Fintan was talking about, starting with the death of Heaney, really again, and just to think about its significance again. There was much greater sense of cultural loss than at the death of poets of comparable eminence and achievement, in a way, of Eliot, for example, or W.H. Auden, or Philip Larkin, or even, say, Robert Lowell. And we seem to have to go back to the death of Yeats in 1939 for an equivalent sort of weight of loss, as it's recorded, for example, in Auden's great poem on the death of W.B. Yeats. And of course, beyond the universal grieving for the loss of a great poet, the poet who was recognized as the greatest contemporary writer of poetry in English, Heaney's death was the occasion, as Fintan has said, of a more particular grieving in Ireland, more so than for Yeats. I suppose for a comparable case of national mourning for a poet, and I think Neil Jordan said this, we have to turn to the 19th century, to the mourning for Pushkin in Russia or Tennyson in England. So what exactly was it about Heaney that made his death such a major national event in a way that's no longer usual for poets? The point about him as king it certainly is central to that. And there was only one death in 2013, only one, that caused an even greater sensation, which was the death of Nelson Mandela. And the comparison clarifies the point, I think, in a way. I mean, Heaney's death brought reactions which more normally mark the passing of leading political figures, and the observances that attended it, like the funeral, were more typical of the reaction to the death of political figures like John F. Kennedy or Winston Churchill or Mandela. And to see how remarkable that is and how exceptional in 21st century, we might recall the best-known observation in Auden's poem on the death of Yeats: "Poetry makes nothing happen. It has no influence on political events." So why is this not true in Heaney's case, where, as Fintan has said, it clearly was. It clearly does affect political events and has meaning for them. When the Irish presidency became vacant the last time, there was widespread kind of rumoured suggestions that Heaney should be a candidate, and he very rapidly scotched it himself. But to draw on the Yeats comparison for the last time, we could recall, I think, the other most famous literary reaction to his death, when T.S. Eliot, in the lecture, the first Yeats commemorative lecture a year after his death in Dublin, said that Yeats was one of those without whom the history of their time cannot be understood. Eliot's observation, it's often said, is surprising in relation to Yeats, because Yeats was an Irish poet of eccentric views and beliefs, who hardly seems representative of his time in any way. But applying it to Heaney suggests another explanation for the universal sense of loss and privation that his death provoked. The kind of collective trauma has been described in various ways because of the way that his work and presence underpinned Irish cultural activity in an unparalleled way, as Fintan has said. John Carey said in reviewing one of the Heaney books in the 1980s, "We are lucky to live while he is writing." It's hard to imagine a greater kind of accolade for a writer, and I thought that very fine remark really had a new sort of poignancy with Heaney's death, of course, because we're still living, but he's no longer living and writing. And we kind of take comfort in going back to the poems, again, as Fintan has said, and we might recall again what Auden said about the death of Yeats, that his death was kept from his poems. Mm-hmm. Which is a very beautiful way of putting it. You know, the poems are still there, and don't worry them with the news that the poet has died. But what we did, I think, throughout his writing life, we felt very lucky to watch that corpus taking shape. There was extraordinary kind of excitement about it. And what are the great gifts that everybody has touched on? And several, Geraldine and I think all of us have commented on the extraordinary kind of exactness and rightness of his descriptive language. You know, whether it's describing blackberries or grains of corn flowing through your fingers or fragments of burning paper floating in the wind or a 56-pound weight, something like that. An obituary piece in Time magazine, a brief one, compared him to Chekhov in his capacity to say something extraordinary by simply describing ordinary things. There's also, of course, the very important readiness to deal with public subjects in Ireland and beyond, his readiness to face the neighbourly murder, his own phrase, that occurred in his native province. Again, his catching of the moment of 9/11 in his Horace translation, "Anything Can Happen," a poem which immediately generated a worldwide set of translations of Heaney's version. And it's the seriousness with which he deals with all these subjects that made him the great poet of his time. And of course, he's much quoted since his death has been the remarkable phrase in the Nobel citation when he won the Nobel Prize, praising his poetry for, quote, a combination of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past, unquote. I've always wondered who said that, because it surely wasn't some Scandinavian apparatchik who came up with that brilliant sort of summary of his. There's a touch of the Heaney to it, I think, in some ways. But the notion of exalting everyday miracles and the living past, I think, kind of says it all in many ways. But the final thing I want to talk about really is what I think is most extraordinary about him. We expect the great writers, you know, Dante, Milton, Yeats, Joyce, to be over-facing. We expect to feel shy in their presence, you know, to feel inadequate when we're faced with them. And we don't think of them particularly as being good company I paused at that point to think about Joyce, actually. Joyce probably was good company, but you might still feel a bit shy in his presence, I think. But Heaney was the most wonderful company, and he made everybody feel good, which perhaps Joyce wouldn't, really. How many people of all capacities or limitations have you met who said, I enjoyed meeting Seamus. I think there was a real understanding between us. And everybody kind of nods sagely. And we've all felt that, I think. And it's kind of slowly dawns on you that the understanding is all being put in by Heaney, really. That's where the understanding is. It's a kind of shared sense of sympathy. And how he managed to make time to do that for everybody is a kind of mystery. And at the same time, to be writing some of the great poetry of the modern era. Think of a poem like Casualty, the haunting poem in which the poet talks in the pub with a local fisherman, feeling shy of condescension, a great phrase. And here we meet the same gift, whether it's warmth or empathy or sheer human skills, really, that appear in one of the most beautiful sonnets in the memory of his mother, the Clearances poems. The idea of being shy of condescension again. The mother shared, quote, the fear of affectation that made her affect inadequacy whenever it came to pronouncing words beyond her. And the son governed his tongue in front of her, a genuinely well-adjusted betrayal of which I knew better. So mother and son are playing that same human game, really, the same subtle, wary, socially accomplished game. Heaney always spoke up for poetry, but it's one of the countless reasons that his loss is so grievous indeed. But he also always said he couldn't have written his poetry if he didn't know that poetry was not the most important thing in the world. That's a very important principle, I think. A kind of principle of reserve and sense of proportion that he'd inherited from his farming forebears, he says. He couldn't have written those great tormented poems of North that faced the horrors of his time so squarely without that skeptical inheritance. So he's able to deal with every situation and every linguistic idiom as was required. And the last thing I thought I'd say is a quotation from Byron, not to keep the possession of Heaney as an entirely Irish matter. Heaney is a cosmopolitan too. Byron said, a great poet belongs to no country. His works are public property. That's true of Heaney, I think, both in relation to Europe, to Eastern Europe, above all perhaps to this country, which has been very important, extensive contact for Heaney. So as well as the loss, the national loss, which is huge and irreparable and understandable, there's also, I think, a human loss, a loss to the world as a whole, which is because he is a great poet in the way that Byron understands and the public property that his writing represents. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank all our panellists for bringing Heaney so very alive again for us and for reminding us of why he was so beloved. And there are two sort of public moments that really speak to what Bernard just said. The day after he died in Croke Park, the semi-final between was it Dublin and Kerry?
Yes,
it was Dublin and Kerry. The semi-final in Croke Park. They announced that there was going to be a minute's silence for Seamus Heaney, and so the entire crowd fell silent for a minute and then rose to their feet in thunderous applause, 80,000 strong people. And it's just this amazing moment of affirmation of who Seamus Heaney was. And we'd love to say it shows the state of poetry in Ireland, but but we know it was all about Seamus Heaney. That's what the applause was all about. And the other thing is, of course, the amazing last text that he sent to his wife that was reported by his son at the funeral, that he texted to Mary, Nolly to Mary, don't be afraid. And one of the last things we were able to put in the exhibition before they pulled up the gangplank on Thursday night was a photograph of those words, don't be afraid, on a gable wall in Dublin that has gone all around the Twitterverse. It was tweeted by someone who said, these are Seamus Heaney's last words, the words we need for these hard times. So very much he's the figure that the nation has lost, the world has lost, and that we can only remember in all the ways we can. So Thanks very much. I'm going to ask you all now to open the floor. We're opening the floor to you if you've got any questions. Could you please stand up and say your name and then ask a question? And Julie's got a microphone she's going to pass if you've got something you want to say.
I wanted to pick up on the last comment about whose possession Seamus Heaney's work is. And I loved hearing the story of having him lift the boxes out of the boot of his car and bring his archive into the National Library. Of course, we all feel it's completely fitting that his archive would be there. And also we have the sense that it would be completely fitting if he has to displace Yeats, that exhibit would go to Sligo. And that's about the kinds of connections between the writer's work and place, so important to Heaney. But then, of course, we also have this irony that we're here, and this speculation that maybe you could get this wonderful exhibit back to Ireland. And so I guess my question is what, Bernard, you were starting to talk about, to ask you to speak a little bit more about the relationship between Ireland, and not the English, but Ireland and the United States, as it's played out in Heaney's writing and career, but also as we move into his archival moment now, right? And we think about where these Irish archives are and where they're landing. And I remember Geraldine thinking when she took this job here that she might be able to do more in and with and for Irish literature at Emory, as opposed to back in Ireland. I may be misrepresenting you, Geraldine. I don't want to do that.
No.
I'm trying to make a point here.
It's certainly what I said in the job interview. Yeah.
But probably, that's it. That's exactly, maybe that's what you said to Ron. And
Another confession.
So anyway, do we think about this as through the history of Irish emigration to the United States? Do we think of this relationship now playing out in literature and in archive as also one fundamentally governed by economics and where the money is? Do we think of it through nostalgia and diaspora? Those are all kinds of lenses that I've seen addressed to this issue of where a writer's archives end up, and so often they end up in American libraries. And so anyway, it's open to anyone, a question for any of the panelists.
Fiona, you're the librarian. You're going to go first.
Well, I'll just respond very briefly, and it's an absolutely fascinating challenge. And I can say very clearly that if we had had to acquire by purchase Seamus's archive, it would not have come to us. So it was only by virtue of donation, and the National Library of Ireland currently has no collections budget. So anything we get is by donation at this particular point in time. Ironically, it is a time of great generosity in terms of donations. I think there's a sense also of realisation from some that we can't buy, so therefore they will donate. And that will change as economic circumstances evolve. Because I came new to the library and I move on, I probably have a slightly different perspective than perhaps some of the archivists and librarians who have been there for 30 years, for whom the loss of an archive, or literary archive, or historical archive, or personal archive is a great and tragic loss to the national collecting institution. And certainly that would be reflected to me. Now, Fintan can probably speak, and Bernard certainly, but certainly Fintan as a good political commentator. Unfortunately, that message is not resonating with funders, as in the government. So I don't see that circumstance changing anytime soon. And despite, and I'll be controversial, despite a lot of rhetoric to support the cultural sector, it's not being supported by finance and funding on any level. So I think that we are looking at a pretty long trajectory of difficult times in terms of acquiring. And we occasionally get offered archives, and we have expensive valuations done, which are essentially teasing my archival and curatorial staff, because at the end of the day, it'll come back with a valuation, and if it's anything above zero, it's next to impossible to proceed. And then you had the situation of whether you would go to government then to make a special case for an acquisition. And unfortunately, not Fintan's fine publication, but other newspapers and media outlets would then run the headline, National Library pays €10,000 for Joyce postcard when children are dying, when cancer wards are closed. So that's not a healthy and normal situation to find ourselves in. I think from my own personal perspective, I think we do, getting back to the point that Bernard was making and quoting Byron, is that so many of contemporary writers, and indeed those who are no longer with us, and going back a little while, are global and are read and enjoyed and understood and researched and loved on a global basis. And so the pragmatic business person in me says it's better that they are acquired and preserved by somebody who cares. And that doesn't matter as much where it is. It would be nice if we could do it, but again, being a realist and a pragmatist. And I think that there are great opportunities for, and this was a good point that was made to me at the dinner last night, at what point does a collecting institution protect what it's acquired, and particularly if you've spent a lot of money acquiring it, and to what extent do they make it available? And there is a fine line, and that's something that has to be discussed over time. But in essence, and there is more of Seamus's material. There is more of other people. I mean, there's literary archives at any point in time that are in this marketplace. It's more important that they are preserved and that they don't get lost. Now, again, it's unlikely that they're going to go in a skip. I mean, we occasionally still acquire material in suitcases that people have thrown out, but that doesn't really happen anymore. So I think that it is an evolving situation. But the good news is that with technology and digitization and the global reach of both the artist and their archive, or the creator and their archive, then it's less of a problem than perhaps in the past, where you had to then visit the institution to see the material. Having said that, you might want people to visit. And for example, what Galway did with the Abbey Archive is a good example, the University in Galway. And again, that's just, I don't want to hog the whole answer there, but that when we found out, Fiach called us up when there was an event at the Abbey Theatre. Fiach McAnee is the director of the National Theatre, and the Abbey Archive, which, by the way, he tried to give me, but he didn't want to give me the archive. He wanted me to give me his rent bill. And, that was, in simple terms, it was a question of transferring. It was in a warehouse on an industrial estate on the outskirts of Dublin. And so it really was a question of saying who's going to store it as opposed to who's going to own it. And that's another interesting dilemma. But initially, when the announcement of the Abbey Archive going to Galway on a kind of digitisation project, for about 5 minutes, my curatorial team were devastated. I mean, how come it didn't come to us, and aren't we the National Library? Mm-hmm. And in the end, it's actually worked out very well, and we've added our own material to that project because it's being digitised, it's been researched, it's being loved and cared for and looked after and reviewed in a way that sitting on a shelf in a warehouse in Finglas wasn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about accessibility, but also then about preserving the original, and they kind of come together. So that's, but I'm sure the others have got views on that.
Well, I mean, when the National Library acquired the Joyce manuscripts in, was it 2000? It was before the crash, definitely. And
yeah, very definitely.
They paid, was it 10 million?
20 million.
20 million, okay. They paid 20 million for the Joyce archive, and it was this huge, actually, moment of national celebration. And Declan Cowbert, I remember, said in the Irish Times it was a matter of literary virility for Ireland to be able to show that they could maintain their own archives and bring them there and hold them there. And of course, now that things are so...
It's the exact opposite.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite. But it's a huge debate, and because, particularly with these writers, and really I can't think of a writer of whom this is not true, that place is so important to who they are and what they write about. But it's inconceivable to me that anyone would work on Seamus Heaney and not want to go to Ireland. That it's not going to stop people from going to the place that these writers are associated with. And there's another Joyce story connected with that. The two great Joyce scholars, Hans Gabler and Brenda Maddox, were both writing on Joyce in the Beinecke, I think it was in Yale, and made this sort of simultaneous discovery where one of them was Brenda Maddox was trying to find out about whether there was a story that Nora Joyce had taken in washing when they lived in Trieste, and Hans Gabler found on the back of a short story in Dublin, from Dubliners, a list of laundry that proved Brenda Maddox's point. And so she says, it's this amazing eureka moment, like there we were in this library, and we discovered, I discovered this point that I wanted to make in my book. And she said, would that moment have been any more magical if it had happened in Dublin or in Trieste or in any of the other places that Joyce actually lived? Did it matter that it happened at Yale? And we might all have different answers to that. You know, I think it does matter if you're reading Wordsworth and you're looking out over the Lake District, or if you're reading Yeats and you're in Sligo, or Joyce and you're in Dublin. And, you know, for Heaney, I think he has in fact created an archive by being buried in Ballachy. You know, he's made that a place of pilgrimage that people will want to return to. But I mean, I think obviously, you know, poetry has no postcodes. It doesn't matter where you are and when you read it, but it's still a political question, or a question of national identity, of where these papers belong and how they're cared for.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for the vast majority of Irish people, for whom of course I can speak, but I would say that most people would like to feel that there was a significant Heaney archive in Ireland.
Yes.
But I also think that the vast majority of people would also feel that it was entirely appropriate that there would be Heaney material in places who cared for him, you know, and really cared about him over long periods of time, including Emory. You know, America was incredibly important to Heaney's life, to the opportunities that he had, to the way in which he saw the world. And I think the good thing with Heaney is, in Ireland, there's no anxiety about Heaney's Irishness, you know.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like Beckett, where you have to think, well, you know, how come he went to France and wrote in French, and is he really Irish? You know, there's nothing to prove. And therefore, I think we can all be quite relaxed about this. You know, everybody knows where Heaney belongs. He was very clear himself about where he belongs. And of course, I mean, to be sort of slightly less optimistic about this, I mean, a little bit of this is to do with the fact that he's not Protestant, you know, that he belonged to the majority culture within Ireland, you know, that it's a culture that the majority of the population would kind of recognize as their own. And that's not entirely a good thing. But it does mean that there is this comfort with who, I was going to say who he is, I would say who he was, but it still is in the poems very much. So I think most people would take a pretty relaxed view of this, so long as I think the fact that the National Library has a significant Heaney archive is important. And once that sort of piety, in a way, has been satisfied, then I think in the contemporary world, with digitization and sharing of material, I don't really see that it would be other than entirely appropriate for a lot of material to be elsewhere as well.
Marilyn.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Richterick. And I have a question, especially for Fiona. I'm wondering what percentage of the Heaney archive at the National Library is actually available now, because a lot of his papers in other places are embargoed in certain areas. I'm just curious about that.
Well, the good news is an awful lot of it, because it's not correspondence. So, and that was one of the sheer joys of the archive, is that it's the literary manuscripts. So the concerns in relation to not for consultation, it's all for consultation. At the moment, it's limited by its condition, limited by our resources, limited by access. But in terms of, it did not come with the not for consultation list, so it's freely available. And that was one of the sheer joys, and the ability then to work with him on a possible exhibition was going to be great as well, because we could again reference check everything and make sure that we weren't misstepping, or that there wasn't something that might have come up along the way that they hadn't thought about, because it was quite extensive. So no, it's all there, it's catalogued, and again, limited access on the basis of our own resources, but not, because it's not correspondence, it's quite good in that respect.
Thank you all. Your affection for the poet makes us love him more, and so thank you for that. It's transparent that you care so much for it. When a big tree goes down, the skyline looks so strange. There's that sad place on the horizon. But it also lets the light come in, and the next generation comes. And I know that we're fortunate, blessed, to have at least one of the great Irish poets in the new generation here with us, in Paul Muldoon. And but who else? Who are the Heaneys? The rising new ones, in your opinions?
They're all women.
They're all women.
Yeah.
I think they're all women.
No, I was joking.
I
But
would have named women. I mean, I would have named Paul, it goes without saying, but then Paul is established as a different kind of status. But of the people after that, I mean, people like Moya Cannon, for example, I mean, people who are not very well known as names yet, I think. But there's a great generation of women poets in both Irish and English, actually, in the generation after.
Sinead Morrissey.
Sinead Morrissey,
Yeah.
Vona Groark is a name I would put
Yeah.
forward. They're really terrific poets.
Leonta Flynn.
Yeah.
There are several.
We're sort of. I think we're looking at the same names because you kind of realize you're going to leave somebody out. Because there's at least half a dozen, I think, really, really excellent women poets as it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And the best of all, perhaps, is Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, who writes in Irish, but she's a very major figure.
But I suppose on the other side, I think if we're talking about poetry as poetry, one wouldn't be at all downcast in terms of the future of Irish poetry. In terms of the great tree as the public figure, I don't think we'll see it again in our lifetimes. It's just so rare. I mean, you just I think it's one of the things you realise that actually, and you were quoting that wonderful phrase about being lucky to be alive at the time when he was writing. And this is a really stupid analogy, and it's terribly trivial in a way. But I remember talking to my son, and he realised at a point that how lucky he was to be reading the Harry Potter books for the first time. That this would never happen again. That actually for his generation, waiting for the next one and feeling that. And I suppose it was one of those moments when when you're about 10 and you suddenly realise, people who are now 6 won't ever get this, and the people who come after that won't happen, and just those books mattered so much to kids, and I mean I don't think that's going to happen again, not just in terms of the poetry, but just in terms of this alignment of the constellations of this figure and the need for him. I mean, there's that sort of famous thing where Brecht says, "Unhappy the land that needs heroes," and some of the need for Heaney's to be a hero arose out of the unhappiness of the place, I think there's a genuine case to be made for the fact that Heaney and his generation of poets, I mean, because he was part of an extraordinary generation, actually did something real in terms of the politics, in terms of what they did with language and making language capacious and ambiguous and capable of holding contrarieties in tension at the same time. All of that stuff that language does was actually crucial. If you look at the Belfast Agreement, which was the peace deal, what did it end up doing? It ended up making a language which different people could read entirely differently at the same time. That was the trick, right? Which was the conflict was insoluble if everybody stuck to what they thought. So you had to construct a language which was so ambiguous that a Protestant loyalist could read it on the one side and think, yeah, that's okay, and the Catholic Republican could read it in the same way and say, yeah, that's okay. It's giving us what we want, even though it was actually hovering in a kind of way. There's a phrase in the Belfast Agreement which actually could have been written by Seamus Heaney, which is, and it's a legal document, it's an international treaty, there's nothing like it anywhere else. It says, though people born in Northern Ireland have a right to be Irish or British or both, as they may so choose. And to say your identity can be multiple. It can be singular, it can be multiple, but it's always a matter of choice. I mean, that's a poetic idea, even if the language itself is not poetic. But keeping alive that idea, that idea is what you experience in those poems, which is that instability of identity and the fact that we live with this instability all the time. And then the political question was actually is shifted from what are you prepared to die for to what are you prepared to live with. Yeah. And actually I think that's what Heaney and his contemporaries gave to the political society. And you hope you won't need that again. I suppose is my point. So that compensates somewhat for the loss that maybe if we'd lost him earlier, the cost would have been worse.
Just kind of quick footnote to the question, really. I mean, the figure of the tree, you know, as the great was most said about Yeats, of course, the death of Yeats. When people like Austin Clarke said, you know, that Yeats soaked up all the moisture around him, so that when that tree was removed, there was nothing else to be done. But of course, in the year that Yeats died, he was born. You know, so it is possible, I think, that major figures do appear again.
Somebody was born last year who we'll be having a conference about 60 years' time.
I want to wrap things up by telling you that we have for sale outside a new Heaney broadside that we had printed for the exhibition, for the opening of the exhibition, and it's the Kite poem, A Kite for Aveen. So that's going to be for sale outside and later on at the opening. But I did want to end by asking Bernard to read for you the poem he wrote in memory of Seamus Heaney that was published in the Irish Times last week, if you don't mind.
And it's the Irish Times again, so.
Yeah, we weren't allowed to mention any other
Media.
newspapers. That was one of his writers.
It's a very small piece, and it's just a translation of 11 lines from the medieval poem Piers Plowman. Of course, Seamus was a great medievalist and a great translator of medieval poetry. But also, as in his poem, the title poem of Seeing Things, he suffered from a kind of hydrophobia. You know, he was terrified of water and of sailing boats. And this little passage said by two friars who were relatively virtuous clerical figures in Piers Plowman in the 14th century sort of covers his case, I think. The Boat, in memory of Seamus Heaney. Take the case of a man in a boat in deep water. The wind and the waves and the craft's tossing cause him to stumble if he makes to stand up, for no matter how firmly he tries to hold on, through the boat slithering, he bends and he staggers, so unstable the body is. And yet he is safe. It's the same with the righteous. If they fall, they're falling only like a man in a boat who is safe and sound, as long as he stays within the boat's timbers. Piers Plowman.
Just like to thank our panelists again and all of you for coming out this afternoon, and hope we see you at the Paul Muldoon reading at 4 o'clock in the Glen Memorial Church. And if you don't have a ticket for Paul Muldoon, I've still got some tickets, and Ron has got some tickets. So get your ticket, and the broadsides will be outside, and also come to the opening at 5:30 this afternoon. I think that's everything.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.